you're not even gonna know that it happened.
Who did this to you?
You did.
You really want to get this guy, don't you?
The protagonist in this film suffers from a form of amnesia where he can't remember the recent past. He spends most of the film looking for who killed his wife, only to learn that he was her killer. And I didn't just choose this movie because I can sympathize with someone who has trouble remembering things. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo episodes. Fresh off their trip to China, the gang now find themselves in Venice, visiting yet another international friend. Their reunion is marred somewhat by the actions of a ghost seemingly out for revenge against the descendants of the man who punished him for treason.
So this is Venice.
Yeah, it sure was nice of our friend Antonio to invite us for a visit.
The gang brought the mystery machine with them, though I'm concerned by how much luggage they packed. They had to have either taken a plane or ship to the city, and their van had to have been stored in the cargo hold. While it's possible they'd have been allowed to keep their luggage inside, most transport companies advise against it because of the risk of damage. Setting that aside, the back of the mystery machine appears to be packed full. We know there's room in the front for the 4 teenagers, but where was Scooby supposed to ride?
Like it's the only city where fish have the right of way.
What the indeed, Lewis. If the writers wanted to make a joke about boats stopping for a line of fish, they could have at least made the traffic cop a human. This light-hearted moment would have worked equally as well and not once again broach complete absurdity. In my opinion, Scooby-Doo works best when they keep the consistent tone of a real-world mystery and the only legitimately supernatural thing was a talking dog.
Well, we better find a gondola. Shaggy, you and Scooby get the luggage.
Does it really take 3 people to look for a gondola? That is a hell of a lot of luggage. Why not just send Daphne and Velma to secure transportation and you stay and help, Fred, Mr. Bench Press 220? Or better yet, just send Daphne because we all know how much Velma can lift. Then again, sending Daphne alone anywhere is a bad idea, considering by this point, she should have more appearances on milk cartons than Stan Lee has cameos. The gang's friend Antonio runs a pizza parlor in Venice, as well as studies art at a local academy. He is also a direct descendant of Doge Malvolio, the ruler of the city-state 5 centuries earlier.
It's so good to see you again, Antonio.
I am glad you could come.
I'm going to nip this one in the bud right now. I'm not a fan of cryptocurrency, NFTs, or other scams like that, so don't expect any Doge meme references in this video. For what it's worth, Doge is Venetian for Duke.
Now that's what I call door-to-door service.
Though considered the city's defining feature, the canals of Venice aren't exactly clean. Gondolas aren't the only means of transport, as there are many engine-powered boats, which means the water contains a large amount of gas and oil. And in addition to that pollution, the canals are also used as drainage, which includes wastewater from homes and businesses. Much of it is treated before it reaches the water, but an uncomfortable truth about the legendary beauty of the Venetian canals is that in addition to their travel needs, it's also essentially their sewage system. Shaggy and Scooby are swimming in sewer water. The Scooby writers were a bit hoity-toity in this episode by slipping in some Shakespeare, specifically The Merchant of Venice. Obviously, the name of the pizza parlor is a dead giveaway, but Antonio was the eponymous merchant, and 2 other characters in the play have names very similar to Professor Solari, one of the staff at Antonio's Art Academy. Malvolio, however, was a character name in a different Shakespeare play, Twelfth Night.
We've got a lot to talk about, but you must be hungry. Just point us to the kitchen and leave everything to us, right, Scoob?
Right, Shaggy?
That is a terrible idea, Antonio. If you're an old friend of the gang, you should know that by now. You'll have no one to blame but yourself when the entire contents of your kitchen get eaten.
Hey, Scooby, does this machine sound broken to you?
Sounds okay to me.
I don't think anyone is going to want to eat that spaghetti.
Make sure they're sliced, Scoob. Coming right up.
I have never had a pizza served like this before.
You've never had a pizza served like that before? A better question might be if you've ever had a Board of Health violation served before, because a dog in your kitchen tossing pizzas into your ceiling fans is how that happens. It's not specifically stated that Antonio owns the restaurant, but the fact that he's a descendant of Italian royalty, as well as comfortable enough allowing Shaggy and Scooby to run free in the kitchen, makes me feel confident that the pizza parlor was his. The fact that he shares the name with the main character in the Shakespeare play his restaurant is named after is also a dead giveaway. Unbeknownst to Antonio, his friend and fellow student Mario was another descendant of Doge Malvolio from a different branch of the family. Antonio's cousin learned that 4 medallions once owned by Malvolio combined into a key to a hidden underground treasure vault, so he intended to steal all of them and escape with a fortune. To cover up his thefts, Mario disguised himself as the ghostly Gondolier, the spirit of a traitor who had been persecuted by his and Antonio's common ancestor. Aspects of this plot mirror several earlier Scooby episodes. You've got a relative trying to steal the family fortune, as seen in episodes like What the Heck's Going On and Scooby's Chinese fortune cookie caper. A friend of the gang was terrorized by an unknown relative in To Switch a Witch, and in Scooby-Doo and a Mummy 2, the villain chased the teenagers to steal a valuable artifact one of them had, which was the key to a much more valuable treasure. Even the idea of a ghost or a monster haunting specific members of a family was the premise of earlier episodes like Go Away Ghost Ship and Vampire Bats and Scaredy Cats. Going further, in that first episode, the ghost of Redbeard had been allegedly seeking revenge against C.L. Magnus for being the descendant of the man who had brought the pirate to justice 300 years earlier, just like how the ghostly Gondolier was allegedly out to punish Antonio for Doge Malvolio's actions 500 years earlier. Setting aside the sloppy lettering of that sign, and holy God is it sloppy, Venice is in Italy, where they speak Italian. While the city does have a robust tourist industry, and it's not uncommon for there to be signs that include English words, it's unlikely they'd use that language for the principal lettering, particularly on their architecture that was probably several centuries old. Antonio's pizza parlor sign was also in English, but an argument could be made it was to attract tourists.
It is the ghostly Gondolier! He has struck again!
Wow. The lettering in the previous shot was bad, but the animators weren't even trying with those background characters. Though it's nice to see the artists from Schoolhouse Rock were able to branch out. This was not an original scheme by Mario. Yahoo! But was it going to be profitable if successful? The only glimpse of the treasure we were given is when the ghostly Gondolier was looking at the inside of the chest in the hidden room. He holds a handful of jewelry, as well as a crown and jewel-encrusted sword and scabbard. We can also barely see that the chest is full of valuables, but there's no way to determine if it's filled with just jewelry or if there's gold inside as well. We also see various other potentially valuable items in the room, including what appears to be a throne, a bust, and tapestries.
Tapestries?
Setting aside any potential gold in the chest, as I've discussed before, putting a price on jewelry is often problematic. While gold can be melted down and sold anywhere, much of the value of jewelry is often contained in the craftsmanship rather than the inherent worth of their individual gems. This only becomes magnified when the pieces have historical value. You could steal England's imperial crown, which, due to its historical and cultural significance, could easily be valued at a few $billion. But if you disassembled it and sold the gems, gold, and cloth off piecemeal to unsuspecting buyers, you'd be lucky to walk away with even a few $1 million. Mario would need to find a buyer with deep pockets that would not only appreciate the historical value of Doge Malvolio's treasure, but also not care how they get hold of it. That same unscrupulous buyer would also be very interested in the rest of the contents of the treasure room because every object had historical value. While we're on the subject, it's worth stressing that this mystery takes place in Venice, and that is an underground chamber. Many Venetian buildings do have rooms below the waterline, and they're generally constructed of waterproof stone. However, even then, they're often very damp and require routine maintenance. If that treasure room was sealed for 5 centuries, everything should have been covered in mold, and the throne and those tapestries would likely have rotted away enough to be nearly unrecognizable. Something else bothers me about that room. Its existence was supposed to have been secret for hundreds of years, but let's carefully look at what's shown in the episode. First, the ghostly gondolier opened the hidden entrance at the base of the column in the city's main plaza, revealing the stairs to the secret tunnel. The gang followed him to the treasure room, which had a standard wooden door anyone could find, not a secret wall or otherwise concealed entry. The ghostly gondolier chased the teenagers through the tunnel, which had at least 2 branches. The boys ran past a flight of stairs that could not have been the same ones they took to reach the tunnel because this set was barred by a locked iron gate. Scooby then accidentally found a hidden dumbwaiter, which he and Shaggy used to escape. The ghostly gondolier then ripped the gate off its hinges and ran upstairs, almost catching the boys from an opening in the shaft, which not only led to what looked to be a tunnel or hallway, there was yet another flight of stairs in the background. Shaggy and Scooby then reached the roof, showing another entry to the shaft that had been opened to the world. Incidentally, while it's tempting to claim that this was another moment of superhuman strength shown by a costumed Scooby villain, this time it's possible that the gate's hinges were rusty, or that Shaggy and Scooby loosened the gate when they tried to pull it off earlier. For a secret treasure room that remained hidden for so many centuries, there were plenty of open, easily discoverable entries to it. Are you telling me that for hundreds of years, nobody in that building ever got curious as to where the dumbwaiter led, or decided to explore the stairs leading down to the underground? Or that at no point since the reign of Doge Malvolio had there ever been the need for engineers to inspect or maintain the foundation? Also, those underground tunnels and chambers were awfully well lit. Nobody was carrying any flashlights with them, nor were there any torches or other sources of light. Even if there had been windows, they wouldn't have been much help because it was night when the gang went down the secret stairs. I can barely see a damn thing in my own basement during the day, despite having several small windows just above the foundation wall. Back to the treasure. Even without finding a buyer who'd pay top dollar for the jewelry pieces intact, Mario would still likely have made multiple millions in 1978 dollars, so the scheme was extremely profitable. If he was careful when he sold everything, it's likely he wouldn't have been caught either, as the treasure's location had been lost for centuries. The best stuff in the world to steal are those things nobody will ever miss. Mario had a plan that was extremely valuable and relatively easy to get away with. However, it not only suffered from a lack of originality, but other issues I'll go into in more detail later. He gets a 3.5 out of 5 for the design. For a gondolier, the ghostly gondolier didn't really look like one. When most of us hear that word, we imagine a guy wearing a striped shirt and a hat, not a purple bodysuit and a hooded cape. But strangely enough, this is one of the few times the Scooby producers managed to get something right when it comes to historical accuracy. Or at least close enough. The striped uniform worn by modern Venetian gondoliers is a newer design and not even 100 years old. Back in the days of Doge Malvolio, gondoliers were generally employed by the wealthy for their private use, much like how a chauffeur for a rich family would be seen today. Owning a gondola would have been seen as a sign of wealth, so the one steering it would have been dressed accordingly, often with colorful outfits in style at the time. Though likely not wearing a cape or hood as they would interfere with operating the vessel, gondoliers back then would have worn hats or other decorative head coverings.
I, Doge Malvolio IV, sentence you to the dungeons for life.
My spirit will roam and curse this city forever.
Led by the ghostly gondolier, Doge Malvolio was overthrown, his fortune vanished.
For sentencing a traitor to life in the dungeon, the Doge was surprisingly nice enough to let him keep his flashy clothes. Seriously, why does the ghostly gondolier look like this in the flashback? Wouldn't he have been stripped of his usual outfit and wearing prison rags? Shouldn't he just look like a normal guy here? The identity of the original ghostly gondolier himself is open to interpretation, but there may be a somewhat sinister element to it. Though winding down during that era, slavery was still active in Venice at the time, and enslaved people were often used to pilot gondolas. That aspect would certainly have an impact on the justification of whatever the ghostly gondolier's original crime had been, and his subsequent wave of destruction and toppling of Doge Malvolio's reign. The villain's disguise in this episode was rather boring, but if it was historically accurate as seen by the flashback, it's unfair to penalize Mario too much for that. After all, he would get a high mark for choosing an appropriate outfit, keeping in line with family history. The two would essentially cancel each other out.
Shaggy, look! There's nothing there. You must be seeing things, Scoob.
Here we go again. Shaggy, you of all people should know better. Ignoring Scooby when he says he sees something scary is like yelling at your dog barking at night only to find out later that he was trying to tell you someone was breaking into your car. The hooded cape and suit may have been necessary, but why didn't Mario use any special effects? He could have doused himself with phosphorescent paint or rigged some wires to allow him to float his gondola above the canals instead of on them. We find out later he was using an inflatable rubber vessel, so that idea is feasible for the Scooby-Doo-niverse. Often the ghostly gondolier is seen at a distance anyway, and the whole point of the inflatable gondola was for a mysterious escape. So instead of being there in person, the villain could have used a film projector instead. Indeed, this episode took place on a dark and misty night, and the fog would have made an excellent surface to display the film. Even if there had been special effects, the outfit wasn't remotely frightening. The ghostly gondolier was clearly just a guy wearing a hooded mask and a bodysuit with boots. Mario was average size too, so he didn't even have an imposing physical presence. That's ignoring the usual inconsistent animation that makes the guy go from being slightly taller than 6-foot-tall Shaggy to shorter than 5'11" Fred, to much, much taller than 6-foot-tall Shaggy. The Scooby-Doo-niverse has also seen its share of villains wearing nothing more than hoods, especially in the series that preceded the Scooby-Doo show. Frankly, the ghostly gondolier looked for all the world like a cross between the green ghosts from Where Are You and Mrs. Baker from the new Scooby-Doo movies. Accurate, but unoriginal and boring, with no special effects and not very frightening, the ghostly gondolier gets an outfit score of 1.5 out of 5. This episode did technically feature a secondary disguise, as Mario wore a pair of red contact lenses. He did so to hide that he was descended from Doge Malvolio, which is why I was willing to chip in that extra half point. Before discussing how well the villain carried out his plans, we need to first examine the location of all the medallions. The purple one was worn by a bust of Doge Malvolio in an alcove situated far above the stage at the Venice Opera House. The red one was stored in a locked display case in the museum next to the Art Academy, and the blue one was around Antonio's neck. It was never revealed where the green one had been kept, but assuming it had been stored under the same general circumstances, there was never any need for Mario to wear a disguise to steal them.
This is the Academy of Fine Arts where I study.
The Art Academy sign is also in English. Instead of stealing the Opera House medallion in the middle of a performance surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, Mario could have broken in after hours wearing nothing more than black clothes and mask to avoid being seen. By going when the Opera House was closed, he had every chance to commit his crime with no one even noticing, especially as the bust was far above the stage where the medallion's disappearance might not be noticed for days or even weeks. It certainly would have been a lot less physically dangerous stealing it that way. Leaping off theater balconies in the middle of a performance is a good way to break a leg.
Where is the other medallion?
It is in the Palace Museum next door. Professor Solari's got the keys. He is the curator.
Take these. Bring them back when you're done. I have important work I must finish.
Here, strange American teenager whom I've never met before. Take the keys to the museum unescorted while I walk away. Even worse, this is the Scooby Gang he's giving the keys to. Public enemy number one for museums. You'd think Professor Solari would have heard of them. Worst curator ever.
Right, boy, do you look ridiculous?
Well, that's rare. Shaggy is the one dressed as a lady.
We do have other paintings from the same period. Some upstairs and some in the basement.
That is right. Mario and I were restoring a couple of old paintings just this week.
What? I don't even know where to begin with this one. Not only is Shaggy rudely messing with an art exhibit and being mean to Scooby for no readily apparent reason, but he's also somehow breaking the physical laws of time and space by magically converting oil paint into actual seawater. All those memes depicting Shaggy as having phenomenal godlike power may have been onto something. The museum heist could have gone just as easily as the hypothetical Opera House theft. Mario could have surreptitiously taken the key from Solari at any point during the school year and stolen the medallion then, rather than when the other robberies had focused all the attention on the one in the museum. He didn't even need the key. It was a simple glass case that didn't appear to be wired with an alarm. He could have used a glass cutter or simply smashed it open. As Antonio's friend and fellow student, Mario would have likely had plenty of opportunities to safely steal the blue medallion. He could have invited Antonio to the gym or to a public pool and taken it while his friend was undressing in the locker room, or even break into Antonio's house at night to take it. He could still have dressed as the ghostly gondolier to fool potential witnesses, though again, it would have been best if he wasn't seen at all. Better yet, Mario could have fashioned a set of fake medallions to leave behind at the crime scenes. They may not have been able to fool an expert or a careful observer, but the purple one was high on stage while the red one was under lock and key, so it's not like anyone had a reason to give them regular scrutiny. Even the worst fake would have likely allowed the villain a large head start to make his getaway. Granted, as he wore the blue medallion daily, Antonio would undoubtedly catch a fake pretty quickly, but that just means Mario would need to steal that one last. But were these medallions even needed in the first place? Something that has always bothered me about fictional primitive technology, in particular when it's used to open doors or set off traps, is there's usually no way in hell that it should ever work. The best example of this is in the first Indiana Jones film, where a spike trap is triggered by breaking a beam of light, as if the ancient Jovitos managed to invent photoelectric switches. Or like how the gang escaped a locked room in the King Katazuma episode after shining moonlight on a wall plate. Unless we're dealing with magic, hidden doors and traps use physical means to operate. Rather than going through all the hassle of stealing the medallions to combine them into the key to the hidden stairs, why didn't Mario just use a crowbar and pry the door open? He wasn't there for the historical value of the lost Malvolio treasure. Like Howard Carter, he was there to loot the place and wouldn't have worried about causing any damage. Mario didn't need the medallions to locate the treasure. He learned its location from the lost portrait of Doge Malvolio. Just knowing that the 4 medallions formed a key to open the hidden entrance should have been enough of a clue for the villain to look for an appropriate slot at the column's base. All this ghostly gondolier business was simply unnecessary. Mario had one goal: steal the lost treasure. He wasn't out for revenge or anything like that. He had no reason to make Antonio scared. In fact, drawing so much attention to the family's history is what made the gang focus on the medallions in the first place. Had Mario discreetly stolen the other three, he could have worn a mask and accosted Antonio on his way home at night and taken his medallion along with his watch and wallet. It would have looked like a simple mugging, and nobody would have thought to check on the other medallions. Or if they had, it would have been too late to stop the villain.
Take a look, Scoob.
Come on, guys. Let Daphne try it on.
Excuse me? Let who try it on?
Let Daphne try it on.
Frank Welker has been voicing Fred for almost a decade by this point. You'd think he'd know how to pronounce her name correctly.
Help! Zoinks! The ghost's got Daphne!
Let those who cross my path beware!
Speaking of odd performances, what was up with that one? Let those who cross my path beware!
No! Get away! Help!
The gondolier must have thought Mario was Antonio.
Red plastic. I think we found a clue.
This seems like as good a time as any to remind everyone that Fred and the rest are not law enforcement. Here they are poking around a crime scene, rearranging furniture, and removing potential evidence from the scene. The Venetian police are going to be pissed. Or however they'd say that in Venetian. El Pisserino.
He must have Antonio! We've got to save him!
Mario will go down in Scooby history for pulling off the first hat trick of stupid kidnapping by abducting Daphne, himself, and one of the gang's friends. If only there had been an uncle here he could have snagged as well. That'd have been the Scooby-Dooverse version of the EGOT. What made all three of these abductions stupid is each one of them was pointless. Instead of taking Daphne and Antonio, the ghostly gondolier should have just grabbed the medallions. Everyone already knew what he was after at this point, so there was no good reason to worry about silencing his victims. Worse, by locking them in the secret dungeon behind the fireplace, it all but ensured the gang would discover the missing portrait of Doge Malvolio and, subsequently, the location of the lost treasure. Staging his own disappearance was also a huge mistake.
I've made a huge mistake.
Let's suppose Mario had managed to find the lost treasure without the gang catching him. The last thing he would have wanted was the authorities spending too much time investigating the art academy or museum. With nobody being in danger, once the Carabinieri wrote a report about the missing medallion, they'd leave the scene because a theft of a piece of medieval jewelry wouldn't be a high priority for them. If Mario managed to get away with the treasure, being a missing person would put his name and face on the public's radar. And not only would he have investigators looking for him, but even rank and file citizens as well.
And who do we have here?
Just us chickens.
Like hell!
Remember, they're in a museum, and that bed Shaggy and Scooby just trashed was an exhibit. Worst curator ever. It was also dumb of the ghostly gondolier to spend so much of his time chasing Shaggy and Scooby, especially after the gang learned the location of the lost fortune. Unless the villain was prepared to commit murder, the jig was up. It wouldn't take long for the gang to return with the authorities, so instead of trying to frighten away the teenagers, Mario should have stuffed his pockets with as much of the loot as possible and cut his losses.
Up here, Shaggy.
Coming right up, but I feel like I'm getting weak in the knees.
Chasing the boys to a rooftop gargoyle was certainly reckless and could have resulted in their deaths, but it doesn't feel as though Mario was directly trying to kill them. Up to that point, the identity of the ghostly gondolier wasn't known, so if he was careful, Mario could have ditched the outfit, pretended to have escaped the villain's clutches, and waited until the excitement died down enough to sell whatever jewelry he managed to steal. While he may not have ended up becoming a millionaire, he'd still have a decent sum of money and, more importantly, not be behind bars. The ghostly gondolier was yet another example of a Scooby villain letting their greed get the better of them. Instead of risking injury, imprisonment, or death, why didn't Mario simply come to Antonio in the first place, admit their family relationship, and try to convince his cousin to work together to secure the lost fortune? After all, Antonio had nothing to lose, because should the authorities learn about the treasure, it's unlikely they'd allow any of Doge Malvolio's descendants to keep it. The Italian government would rightfully conclude it belonged to the country and simply take it. Though there would have been a good chance that to prevent a prolonged legal battle, they might have been willing to negotiate a substantial settlement, perhaps up to 10% of the treasure's worth as a finder's fee.
Sink to the bottom, you fools!
I must have watched this scene about a dozen times, because I cannot tell what is happening. Gondolas are not punts in a shallow river. Venetian canals can be over 15 feet at their deepest and are not driven by poles like what's seen here. Gondolas are propelled by narrow oars. What the hell is Shaggy doing with the pots? It looks like he's bailing water out of the boat. You can clearly see him dipping in and out of the gondola. Even if he was supposed to be using them as makeshift paddles, it took both Fred and Scooby pushing off the wall to get the gondola moving, followed by the two of them rowing. Thus, Shaggy was not propelling the craft. The villain did stab the gang's gondola with a pole, sinking it, but that wasn't until the end. I'm wondering if the villain was supposed to put a hole in their gondola before taking off in his to keep them from pursuing him, and the scene was deleted, or the writers forgot to put it in. Or the animation studio didn't read the directions carefully enough and animated Shaggy bailing out the boat throughout the scene instead of just after the hole was put in it. Incidentally, Fred just straight up tried to kill the ghostly gondolier by impaling him. The last thing I want to discuss is the attempt made to hide the fact that Mario was a member of the Malvolio family lineage. I give the Scooby writers props for a unique idea, but frankly, they should have spent a bit more time on it. For starters, using red contact lenses to turn green eyes brown is very questionable, since they do make opaque brown contact lenses. But why should the villain even bother in the first place? Green eyes are certainly rare, but they're not impossible. If Antonio met someone with green eyes, he's more likely to simply shrug and say, "Oh, that's interesting," and then go on with his life, rather than worry the person was a hitherto unknown member of the family. The writers really dropped the ball, because what they should have done was make the Malvolio family line have heterochromia, or eyes with different colors. That would have been much more rare, and the steps Mario took to hide it in himself would have made a lot more sense. Plus, it just would have been cooler. Mario greatly overthought his entire scheme, put himself in unnecessary physical danger, performed stupid kidnappings, and let himself get distracted by Shaggy and Scooby. He did at least manage to get hold of all 4 medallions and find and open the treasure room, but even then he was sloppy. He gets a 2 out of 5 for the operation. The ghostly gondolier gets a final due score of 2.3 out of 5.
Relax, guys. It's only the gondolier who took us to the pizza parlor.
Here are your car keys. I've been chasing you all over Venice, trying to give them back to you.
I mentioned in my last video how I can't believe just how carefree the gang are when their van breaks down. And here's Fred smiling after finding out he had been running around Venice without his car keys. How do these teenagers manage to operate in the real world?
Like we should have ordered submarine sandwiches.
Yeah.
I did mention that's Venice's sewer system, right? I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon members and apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. Artyom. Thank you, Artyom. Joe Cross Carl the Stuntman Forever. Thank you, Joe Cross Carl the Stuntman Forever. Carl the Stuntman. Thank you, Carl the Stuntman. Xeris Tyran. Thank you, Xeris Tyran. Crazy Shark 8000. Thank you, Crazy Shark 8000. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal thank you in the next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a paid member. Fresh off their trip to Venice, the gang now find themselves in Puerto Rico. They're not there to see anyone this time around, however, but simply engaging in a vacation from, presumably, driving around the country aimlessly solving mysteries for free.
Fred, look! What's going on over there?
He must be searching for something.
Let's go take a look.
Good idea, Velma.
Yes, I'm certain the port authorities would love to have a bunch of teenagers getting in the way of their investigation. Not content with simply enjoying themselves fishing, Fred and the rest poke their noses into a recent museum robbery, culminating in a visit to a nearby fortress after hearing a large explosion. There, Shaggy and Scooby discover the derelict stronghold is home to the ghost of a 16th century Spanish general, tenaciously guarding his sanctum from meddlesome intruders.
Shag, you and Scooby keep an eye on the mystery machine.
Okay, Fred, like we'll be right here, chowing down on the native fruit.
Sure, Shaggy. Help yourself to whatever's in the shipping crate. He's literally stealing food in the middle of transport. He's lucky the police are too busy searching for stolen treasure.
Nah, Scoob, pineapple's no good for you.
This may be the only time in the franchise any of the gang actually point out that a food isn't good for Scooby. Of course, Shaggy's wrong here, as small amounts of unsweetened pineapple is just fine for dogs. But it's the thought that counts, right? The owner of an island charter boat, Captain Eddie, smuggled a fortune in gold, jewelry, and artifacts from a local museum to a nearby abandoned fortress through a secret tunnel. In order to get the loot past the authorities, he sealed the stolen goods in hollow cannonballs and shot them to his boat from a cannon atop the fortress, where they would gently descend by parachute. To frighten away anyone curious to know what all the loud explosions were, Captain Eddie disguised himself as the ghost of Juan Carlos, a Spanish general who commanded the fort hundreds of years ago. Jesus, this was a dumb plan. To be fair, though, it started out brilliantly. Using a hidden tunnel that led from the place you were robbing to an abandoned location is a mainstay of crime fiction, including a Sherlock Holmes villain. However, to go from quietly sneaking your loot to your hideout to blasting what you stole to your waiting transport via cannon shots loud enough to shake the entire town takes a superhuman amount of stupidity.
I hope the police catch those thieves soon.
Right, Daphne, before the treasures are smuggled out of the country.
Treasures. In fact, even the brilliant part of the plan was kind of dumb, considering the entrance to the secret path was outside the museum on the sidewalk next to the street. You'd think someone who managed to quietly transport that much stolen treasure over a wall down to the tunnel would have found a way to move their loot to their boat without drawing so much attention to themselves. It was definitely a valuable heist, considering what we see on screen. And even discounting the obvious historical value of the stolen goods, it had to have been worth tens of millions of dollars at the time, possibly the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. though we are given conflicting information during the episode itself.
Wow! Amazing! Look at all this stuff.
The stolen treasures.
Here we see a significant amount of treasure, but as we find out later, it's only a portion of what was taken from the museum.
Allow me to congratulate you on locating part of the missing treasure. Unfortunately, our ghost friend has already managed to move much of it out of the country.
Going by Inspector Armandez's words that the thief moved much of the treasure already, the full amount of the stolen goods could be twice what's seen here.
We located the rest of the treasures on his boat, Inspector.
However, what the police found on Captain Eddie's boat seemed to be a lot less than half of what was in the fortress. Granted, this could be everything that was stolen, and technically what Inspector Armandez said was true when he referred to the treasure in the fortress as part of the total amount stolen, and what was recovered from the boat as much of it. It's just that one would have expected a lot more to have made it to Captain Eddie's boat based on the words used. This is just semantics, though, and frankly not that important when considering the biggest flaw in the entire scheme. But that can wait until later when I discuss the operation itself. This section is just for the design of the plan and whether it was original, safe to implement, and worth the risk of getting caught. It's fair to say it was worth it, considering how many millions of dollars were at play. The same can't be said for how safe it was, considering not only was Captain Eddie loudly drawing attention to his hideout, but that was a cannon that used gunpowder. Even back in the day, operators were always at risk of getting killed by an explosion, which is one of the reasons you don't see this kind of armament on the battlefield these days. It wasn't a very original plan either, as museums have been targeted by plenty of Scooby villains in the past, let alone how many of them made their escape via a secret tunnel.
Secret tunnel!
I'm giving Captain Eddie a design score of 2 out of 5. All this plan really had going for it was the dollar amount involved. This may be the single most boring villain disguise in the entire 3 seasons of the Scooby-Doo show, and easily near the bottom of the franchise as a whole. Setting aside its lack of special effects or anything even approaching menacing, the ghost of Juan Carlos just looks like a pudgy guy wearing a bland soldier's outfit from a few hundred years ago. Captain Eddie was wearing a mask under the helmet, so why didn't he get creative by making the face gaunt or discolored, giving it red eyes or fangs or anything that would make it look even the least bit frightening? You can't even argue that the producers were going for a historically accurate disguise, because this is anything but. For starters, the helmet is inaccurate, or at least I found no historical images supporting that design. The ghost of Juan Carlos was ostensibly wearing what's called a Morion helmet, popularly known as a conquistador helmet, as those psychopaths were often depicted as wearing them. However, those helmets generally featured leather or small plate face guards, not a full wraparound metal casing as seen here. Further, why would the ghost wear just a plate helmet and not the rest of the armor associated with it? If you look at any painting of a contemporary 16th century Spanish soldier, if they're wearing a helmet, they're wearing the rest of their armor, even if it's just a breastplate. In fact, often they're depicted wearing a breastplate and no helmet. And, as a general, Juan Carlos would have likely been wearing much more ornate clothing as appropriate for a man of his rank. We also see a good example of the Wiggles effect in action with this episode. When not in his disguise, Captain Eddie is a man of some girth. I mean, he's not as out of shape as some people I could mention. But he's clearly not in his prime. Yet not only does the Ghost of Juan Carlos outfit do a lot to hide his paunch, but during the episode, we see the villain perform some truly intense physical acts, like climbing 20-foot tall brick walls that should not have been possible with his body type. The only positive I can give this disguise, and this is really stretching, is that it's original. This is the first conquistador ghost we see in the franchise, but what will come decades later will be so much better. That originality barely bumps up the outfit score to a 1.5 out of 5. I'm jumping straight to the biggest problem with Captain Eddie's actions, shooting the loot to his boat. There is no conceivable way he managed to move that much treasure out of the fortress using the methods seen in the episode. It is so blindingly obvious, I didn't even have to spend any time working on the math. Math.
Listen, you two can stay out here if you want to, but we're going inside.
Like on a clear day, I bet you could see all of Puerto Rico from here.
Wait a minute. Why are Shaggy and Scooby inside the fortress? Fred literally told them they could stay outside.
Zoinks! It is hot!
It's unlikely that this was an original canon, as the fortress would have been decommissioned and any armaments would have been either removed or at least filled with metal to render them unusable. However, if this was a legitimate 16th century weapon, it could take up to an hour to cool down. So this may have been historically accurate. And that's a problem for Captain Eddie. Look at the size of the hollow cannonballs he used. Now, look at the amount of contraband allegedly recovered from his boat. That would have taken several dozen cannon shots to get that much to his ship. We don't know when the museum was robbed, but presumably it wasn't that long before the gang arrived in Puerto Rico if the authorities were still searching the docks for the stolen treasures. To get that much loot moved to his boat would have required the ghost of Juan Carlos to be blasting his cannon repeatedly at all hours of the day and night. With that many explosions repeatedly shaking the town, the idea that the local police wouldn't have visited the fortress to investigate is inconceivable.
Inconceivable!
When used in battle, cannons of that type had a cooling system whereby each shot would be followed by the barrel being doused with water or oil to stop it from overheating, allowing for it to be fired repeatedly. That wasn't the case here, as seen by how hot it was by the time Shaggy and Scooby discovered it. So Captain Eddie would have been forced to wait at least an hour between shots. Taking downtime into consideration, he had to sleep sometime, and the fact that he was still taking tourists on fishing excursions really limited how many hours in the day were available to fire the cannon, possibly as few as 6 or 8 per day.
A couple of more nights and I would have had it all.
Bullshit. It would have taken weeks to get that much treasure out to his boat via cannonball. Also, there's no way that chest, barrel, or those strong boxes would have been able to fit inside the cannonballs. Even if we were to assume those weren't from the museum and were supplied by Captain Eddie himself to store the gold he transported, what about those crowns? There's no way the orange one would have fit inside a cannonball without being mangled.
Put down those cannonballs!
Gee, what's this? A hollow cannonball!
And look at how easily the hollow cannonballs opened simply from being dropped. Cannon fire involves an intensive amount of kinetic energy. If those balls open so easily, how in the hell could they remain sealed after being fired? Backing up to elaborate on something I briefly touched on, in the middle of his crime, Captain Eddie was still running his charter business, taking tourists out on fishing excursions. You'd think he would have had better things to worry about. Or was this his way of trying not to draw attention to himself by maintaining his regularly scheduled business? If so, that's not a bad way to maintain your cover. However, it also meant delaying how long it would take to get all the loot transported. The longer Captain Eddie remained in the city with the stolen goods, the more time the authorities would have to find him. There was also the danger of his customers stumbling into wherever he was storing the stolen treasure on his boat. That's something the Scooby Gang excel at.
Legend has it that the spirit of Juan Carlos, a 16th century Spanish general, is still guarding the old fortress.
Big mistake, Captain Eddie. Up to this point, Fred and Velma hadn't heard anything about the ghost of Juan Carlos. If he hadn't mentioned that, their curiosity about the fortress wouldn't have been rekindled, and they would have had no reason to go back there. This is all the more reason he shouldn't have been taking charters in the middle of his heist.
Nice try, you guys.
How did Shaggy get hold of the fishing pole again? He clearly dropped it at some point earlier. Perhaps Captain Eddie wasn't too concerned about potential witnesses on his boat because he was vicious enough to be willing to deal with them permanently.
Oh, no! I will teach you to defy me!
Like, it's Doomsville for sure, Scoob.
It's been a while, but we once again see a Scooby villain try to commit murder, though even here rather stupidly. Captain Eddie wasted a lot of time trying to pry off the stone Shaggy and Scooby were dangling from, but Shaggy's just holding on with his hands. Why didn't the villain just smash the teenager's fingers with that wooden stick he was holding?
Look out, girls!
In fact, Captain Eddie tried committing murder twice this time around, and the second time his victims would have been Fred and the girls, which is rare. Kudos to him.
Oh no, a dead end!
You are trapped forever, my amigos!
Wait a minute. If it was a dead end, how did Captain Eddie make it out of there and back to the door to lock them in? Before wrapping this up, I want to discuss just how sloppy the writing was with this episode, specifically how the gang managed to connect the fortress shenanigans with the museum robbery.
No, there's no water damage to the fabric at all.
And look, it's much too small for a man to use.
The answers to this mystery just might be at the Hall of Records.
Exactly how did Velma come up with that idea? Up to this point in the episode, all the gang knew was that there was a museum robbery and that the loud explosion they heard may have been coming from a nearby fortress. Allegedly, the sound of a ghost firing off a cannon. There was no known connection whatsoever between these two facts.
Why do you disturb me so late at night?
There's something strange going on at the El Moro Fortress, senor, and we think there might be a connection with the recent museum robbery.
Why would they think that? The only physical clue they had was a parachute they fished up from the ocean, which doesn't immediately link the museum robbery with the fortress or anything else. For all they knew, the parachute could have been used to allow someone's pet dog to parasail with them. There had been nothing at this point that would link the two locations. Incidentally, it's nice to see a sign on a building in the actual local language for a change.
I'm sorry, it is late. You must all leave.
But
You must leave! Boy, what got into him?
Oh, I don't know. It's late at night, long after the Hall of Records was closed. He was probably stuck working late, and out of nowhere, a group of nosy teenagers demanded entry and started talking nonsense about fortress ghosts and museum robberies. Then again, it's possible the curator recognized the Scooby Gang and wanted them gone before they destroyed any historical artifacts. You could learn from this guy, Professor Solari.
Okay, there's the museum.
And according to the map at the Hall of Records, the tunnel is right underneath us.
Let's see if we can get inside to check it out.
They're just casually talking about breaking and entering the museum. No wonder Inspector Armandez was following them. They're suspicious as hell.
whoops!
You found it, Daphne! There's an opening under this phone booth.
Jinkies, this phone booth is a fake.
No wonder the police missed it.
A phone booth can't get much more out of order than having literally no equipment inside it, or any cables leading to it. Not noticing something this obvious really makes the local police look incompetent, especially how a skinny girl like Daphne was able to so easily move it. I don't blame Inspector Armandez looking annoyed here. Smart-ass teenagers. Captain Eddie's actions were not those of a master criminal. Though he managed to steal a lot of valuable treasure from right under the watch of the local police, his method of transport was cumbersome and drew way too much attention to himself. He also bafflingly kept his day job when his time would have been better spent finding a faster and safer way to get his loot out of the city. a job, incidentally, that put him into direct contact with the gang and nudged them towards solving the mystery. His only redeeming actions were the 2 times he tried killing the meddling teenagers, which at least showed he understood the stakes. Captain Eddie gets a 2 out of 5 for his operation. This leaves the ghost of Juan Carlos with a final due score of 1.8 out of 5.
Never mind answering. It's good to see you.
Why are they suddenly outside?
Well, I'm glad that mystery's over.
You said it, Velma. Like now we can get down to some serious vacationing.
Seriously, what's with the sailor suit? And that's my ranking of the villains from the 7th set of episodes of the 3rd season of the Scooby-Doo show, shown here along with the ones from my previous videos. The ghostly gondolier wasn't anything special, but wow, the ghost of Juan Carlos was simply pathetic. All he had going for him was the value of his scheme and his bloodlust. And even then, he was right down there at the bottom of the list with Charlene Wilcox, a villain so pathetic, I had to give her a first name. There's only 2 more episodes of the Scooby-Doo show left, and at a quick glance of the upcoming villains, I'm not holding out much hope for a triumphant conclusion to the series. I hope to see you next time. One last thing before the end. Check out this awesome piece of fan art I was sent by one of my Patreon supporters, FoodWizard565. This is brilliant and really helped bump up what has so far been a fairly lousy end of the year. Thank you so much again for this, FoodWizard565. It really made my month. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. Patreon members receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout-out in the next regular video produced after they join.